There is a kind of poverty that does not begin in your wallet. It begins in your mind, long before a single coin is lost, long before the bills pile up on the kitchen table, long before the bank account runs dry. It begins quietly, invisibly, in the way you think, in the way you speak, in the way you move through the mornings of your life. It sneaks through the front door of your home, disguised as comfort, disguised as habit, disguised as the small, ordinary choices that seem too insignificant to matter. But the Stoics knew the truth. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor who commanded the most powerful empire the ancient world had ever seen, wrote in his private journal, a journal he never intended for anyone else to read, that the quality of a man's life is determined not by great dramatic decisions, but by the quiet, accumulated weight of his daily disciplines. He understood that poverty is not a sudden event, it is a slow process. It is a collection of habits, practiced day after day, until one morning a person looks around and cannot explain how everything slipped away. Seneca, the brilliant philosopher and statesman, warned his friend Lucilius with words that cut like a surgeon's blade. "It is not that I am brave enough to face poverty, it is that I am wise enough not to invite it in." And today, right now, in this very moment, poverty may already be sitting at your table. Not because fate has been cruel to you, not because the world has conspired against you, but because certain habits, 7 very specific habits, have been opening the door and welcoming poverty inside your home every single day, without you ever realizing it. This is not a lecture. This is not a judgment. This is a mirror. And if you are brave enough to look into it, what you see today could change the entire trajectory of your financial life. Stay with me. Every word of this matters. Welcome to Stoic Wisdom. If this is your first time here, you have found something rare, a place where the ancient philosophy of the Stoics meets the real, raw, practical challenges of modern life. The Stoics were not dreaming idealists. They were emperors, generals, slaves, and statesmen who faced war, loss, illness, financial ruin, and the collapse of everything they had built. And they developed a philosophy so powerful, so grounded in truth, that it has survived 2,000 years and continues to transform lives today. Before we go any further, if this kind of wisdom speaks to your soul, if you believe that the right words heard at the right moment can redirect an entire life, then please take a moment right now to like this video. That one small action tells the world that this kind of content matters, that wisdom is worth spreading. And please subscribe to Stoic Wisdom if you have not already done so. Hit that bell notification so that you never miss a single message, because we release powerful content regularly and you do not want to miss what is coming next. Leave a comment below this video. Tell us which of the 7 habits we are about to discuss do you recognize in your own life. There is tremendous power in honest self-reflection, and your comment might be the very thing that helps someone else wake up to something important. Share this video with someone you care about, a friend, a family member, a colleague, because the people we love most are often the ones most in need of hearing what we are too afraid to say to them directly. And if this channel has brought you value, if Stoic Wisdom has helped you think more clearly, live more deliberately, or find peace in difficult moments, please consider supporting us through Super Thanks. Your support keeps this channel alive and allows us to continue creating the content that is changing lives around the world. Now, let us begin. The Stoics believed in one foundational truth above all others, that we are the architects of our own fate. Not completely, Stoicism was never so arrogant as to claim that humans control everything. The Stoics had a word for what lies beyond our control. They called it the external world, the realm of circumstance, the domain of fortune, and they acknowledged freely that fortune does as she pleases. But they also believed, with absolute conviction, that everything that lives inside us, every habit, every response, every pattern of thinking, every morning ritual, Every conversation we hold with ourselves before the rest of the world wakes up, all of that belongs to us. All of that is ours to command. And here is the devastating truth that most people live their entire lives never confronting. The habits that bring poverty into a home are not the habits of lazy people. They are not the habits of unintelligent people. They are the habits of people who have simply never been shown where the door was, who have never had someone stand with them and say, "Look, here is the entrance that poverty uses. Here is how it walks in. Here is what it looks like before it has fully arrived." 7 habits, 7 doors. And today, we are going to examine every single one of them with the precision of a Stoic philosopher and the urgency of someone who understands that time is the only resource that, once spent, can never be recovered. Let us talk about the 7 habits that bring poverty into your home. Habit 1. The habit of sleeping past your purpose. There is a sentence in Marcus Aurelius's Meditations that has the power to reorganize a person's entire relationship with the morning. He writes, and remember, he is writing this to himself in his private journal. As a reminder, as a discipline, he writes, "At dawn, when you have trouble getting out of bed, tell yourself, 'I have to go to work as a human being.'" Read that again, not as an emperor, not as a philosopher, as a human being. Because being fully human, in the Stoic understanding, means showing up for the life you have been given, with full participation, with deliberate engagement, with the radical decision each morning to take hold of the day before the day takes hold of you. The first habit that invites poverty into your home is the habit of sleeping past your purpose. And when I say this, I am not talking about sleep itself. The Stoics were not cruel. They understood that the body requires rest. Seneca himself wrote extensively about the importance of caring for the physical vessel. Sleep is not the enemy. The enemy is the slow, comfortable surrender to the morning. The enemy is the half hour that becomes an hour, the alarm dismissed not once but 3 times, the gentle, seductive slide back into the warmth of the sheets when the day your day, the one that belongs to you, is already beginning without you. The enemy is the pattern that this creates over time, because here is what the morning represents from a Stoic perspective. The morning is the moment when the day is still entirely yours, before the demands of others have invaded your mind, before the inbox is opened, before the phone has delivered its first wave of information, before the world has begun making its requests of you. For those first quiet minutes or hours of the morning, the day belongs entirely to whoever is awake enough to claim it. And poverty, financial poverty, poverty of mind, poverty of ambition, is always claimed by people who were still asleep when the morning was given away. Think about this carefully. The great fortunes of the world, the great bodies of work, the great accomplishments of human civilization, they were built, not in one dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of thousands of early mornings. The writer who finished the book did so 1 chapter at a time, mostly in the quiet of the early hours before the household stirred. The entrepreneur who built the company did so by being awake and working when competitors were still comfortable in bed. The student who passed the examination did so because they had been rising early to study while others were pressing snooze. Marcus Aurelius governed the Roman Empire while simultaneously waging war on multiple fronts, managing a vast bureaucracy, raising children, writing philosophy, and dealing with the weight of being the most powerful human being alive. How? He wrote about it himself. He made a discipline of the morning. He made a practice of rising with purpose. And he reminded himself daily, repeatedly, that the comfortable choice and the right choice are almost never the same choice. Epictetus, the former slave who became one of the greatest philosophers in human history, taught from a place of radical understanding about how much can be accomplished from within conditions of apparent limitation. His life was proof that circumstance does not determine outcome, habit does. And he taught his students that the discipline of the morning was not a small thing. It was a signal. It was a declaration. It was your soul announcing to itself and to the universe, I am choosing to participate fully in my own life. Now, let us be honest with ourselves for a moment, because the Stoics valued honesty above comfort always. How many hours have you lost to the habit of extended sleeping past your purpose? Not sleep. Sleep is necessary and beautiful. But the half-conscious, half-awake drift that happens after sleep is complete. When the body has been given what it needs and the mind is simply too attached to comfort to rise? How many mornings have begun with you already behind, already playing catch-up, already handing the best hours of your day to inertia? And here is the financial dimension of this habit that most people never see clearly. The poverty that sleeping past your purpose creates is not simply a matter of lost productivity, though lost productivity is certainly part of it. The deeper poverty is the poverty of intention. When you begin the day reactively waking late, scrambling immediately to respond to the world around you, jumping into the demands of others before you have spent even a moment with your own plans, your own goals, your own vision for the day, you are handing the authorship of your day to forces outside yourself. And people who cannot author their days cannot author their financial lives. The person who is always reacting is always behind. The person who is always behind is always catching up. The person who is always catching up never gets ahead. And the person who never gets ahead cannot build wealth, cannot build financial security, cannot build the kind of life that requires you to have thought about it before you live it. The Stoics would say, wealth is not stumbled upon, it is constructed, and construction requires planning, and planning requires time, and time requires that you be awake enough, early enough, intentional enough to take it. So what does the Stoic solution look like? It does not look like a miracle morning routine promoted by a self-help influencer. It does not look like ice baths and affirmations and a 500-step morning protocol. The Stoic solution is quieter and more powerful than all of that. It looks like this. Decide, the night before, what you will do with the first hour of your morning. Write it down if necessary. Commit to it. And then, when the alarm sounds, remember what Marcus Aurelius remembered, that you are a human being, that being human means participating, and that every morning you choose comfort over purpose. You are practicing, at a very deep level, the habit of choosing comfort over purpose. And that is a habit that will follow you out of the bedroom and into every corner of your financial life. Poverty loves people who practice comfort over purpose. It settles in comfortably alongside them, and it stays. Habit 2, the habit of speaking poverty into existence. The Stoics were among the first great thinkers to identify the profound and inescapable relationship between the words we use and the reality we inhabit. Long before modern psychology had names for cognitive patterns, long before neuroscience had mapped the way language shapes neural pathways, the Stoics understood something essential and practical. What you say to yourself repeatedly becomes what you believe, and what you believe becomes what you do, and what you do becomes what you have. The second habit that brings poverty into your home is the habit of speaking poverty into existence. And I want to be very specific here, because this is a habit that is so deeply ingrained in so many people that it has become invisible to them. It is not a conscious choice. It is a reflex. It is the first response that comes out of the mouth before the mind has had a chance to intervene. Listen to the words. Listen to the language of poverty, because it is everywhere. And once you learn to hear it, you will hear it constantly, in the conversations of friends, in family dinners, in your own internal monologue. We can't afford that, said not as a temporary statement of current circumstance, but as an identity, as a permanent condition, as the definitive truth about who this family is and what they deserve. Money doesn't grow on trees, said as a limitation, as a ceiling, as a belief system that positions money as scarce, as difficult, as something that only comes to others. Rich people are just lucky, said to justify the gap between where one is and where one wants to be. to eliminate personal responsibility from the equation, to make poverty feel inevitable rather than reversible. "I'm just not good with money," said as if this were a fixed trait, a genetic condition, a permanent feature of character rather than a skill that can be learned, a habit that can be changed, a muscle that can be built. "What's the point of trying? It never works out for people like us," said with the full force of a self-fulfilling prophecy, designed unconsciously but effectively to keep the speaker exactly where they are. Epictetus taught that the most important discipline a human being can practice is the discipline of judgment, the practice of examining what we say to ourselves about things and asking whether our interpretation serves us or destroys us. He did not say that circumstances do not matter. He acknowledged that life presents us with conditions we did not choose. But he was absolute in his insistence that the story we tell about those conditions is entirely within our power. And the story most people tell about money is a story of poverty. It is a story learned in childhood, absorbed from parents and grandparents and communities who themselves had absorbed it from generations before them. It is a story told in the language of scarcity, of limitation, of people like us and that's not for us, and who do you think you are? It is a story told so consistently, for so many years, that it begins to feel like fact rather than narrative. But here is the Stoic truth. It is narrative. It has always been narrative, and narrative can be changed. Marcus Aurelius wrote, in some of the most honest self-examination ever committed to paper, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." He was not speaking about positive thinking in the shallow modern sense of the phrase. He was speaking about something far deeper and more demanding, the disciplined practice of examining your own mental content, identifying what is useful and what is destructive, and choosing, deliberately and repeatedly, to reinforce what serves your life and release what undermines it. Now, let us talk about how this plays out in practical financial terms, because the Stoics were never interested in philosophy that did not connect to life as it is actually lived. When you consistently say, "I can't afford it," you are not simply describing your current financial situation. You are reinforcing a mental model in which you are a person who cannot afford things. And a person who is convinced, at the level of identity, that they cannot afford things does not naturally develop the habits, the strategies, the creativity, or the discipline necessary to change that situation. Why would they? Their mind has already accepted the conclusion. But when you change the language even before the circumstances change, something begins to shift. Not magically, not instantly, but meaningfully and consistently. "I can't afford it" becomes, "That is not where I am currently choosing to allocate my resources." "I'm bad with money" becomes, "I am learning to manage money better every day." "Rich people are just lucky" becomes, "Wealth is built through specific habits and decisions that I can study, understand, and practice." This is not self-deception. This is Stoic discipline. The Stoics were not pretending that poverty does not exist. They were not telling the poor that their struggles are imaginary. They were making a precise philosophical point. The language you use to describe your situation creates the mental environment in which all of your decisions are made. And if that environment is one of resignation, limitation, and scarcity, then every decision you make will be shaped by those assumptions. The family that speaks constantly about what they cannot have raises children who grow up expecting not to have it. The household where the language of money is consistently the language of fear, scarcity, and powerlessness becomes a household where financial fear, scarcity, and powerlessness feel normal and inevitable. And poverty does not need to force its way into homes like that. It simply walks in because the door has already been held open by words. Seneca wrote, "Ita facmi lucili, vindicata tibi." Claim yourself for yourself. Reclaim ownership of your own life, your own mind, your own story. And one of the most powerful ways to begin that reclamation is to audit, ruthlessly and honestly, the language with which you have been describing your financial life. For the next 7 days, just 7 days, pay attention to every sentence you speak or think about money. Write them down if you can. Notice the patterns. Notice the defaults. Notice the automatic responses that emerge without your conscious participation. And then ask yourself, with stoic honesty, is this the language of someone who is building a better financial life? Or is this the language of someone who has already decided that a better financial life is not possible? Because poverty listens to your words before your bank account does, and it takes up residence in the language long before it settles into the numbers. Habit 3. The habit of consuming without creating. There is a profound and devastating asymmetry at the heart of modern life, and the Stoics, though they could not have named it in our contemporary terms, understood its essence completely. The asymmetry is this. We live in an age where consuming has been made maximally easy and maximally pleasurable, while creating has been made to feel maximally difficult and maximally uncertain. And the result, for millions of people, is a life spent entirely on the consumption side of that equation, watching, scrolling, buying, eating, binging, absorbing, while the creative side, the generative side, the side that actually produces value, produces income, and produces financial freedom, remains largely untouched. The third habit that brings poverty into your home is the habit of consuming without creating. Marcus Aurelius was obsessed with a concept the Stoics called to kathekon, the appropriate action, the duty, the thing that is uniquely yours to do, that only you can do, that the world requires of you. He understood that a human life has both a receptive dimension and a generative dimension. We receive, we learn, we observe, we absorb knowledge and experience. But then we must generate, we must produce, we must contribute, we must put something into the world that was not there before. A life spent entirely in reception is, by Stoic definition, an incomplete life, and economically, it is a life that will always be behind. Think about the structure of wealth creation. At its most fundamental level, wealth is created by producing something that other people value. A product, a service, a skill, a solution, a piece of art, a piece of writing, a system that makes something easier or better or more beautiful. Wealth flows toward creators, toward the people who make things that the world wants. And it flows away from pure consumers, people who only receive what others have made, who only spend on what others have created, who never sit down and ask themselves, what can I make? What can I build? What can I offer? This is not a moral judgment, it is an economic description. The world rewards value creation, and value creation requires the habit of creating. Now, let us examine what the habit of consuming without creating actually looks like in daily life, because this is where many people will recognize themselves and where the discomfort of genuine self-examination becomes necessary. How many hours each day do you spend consuming content? Social media, streaming services, television, YouTube, podcasts consumed while doing nothing else, time spent absorbing what others have made, what others have created, what others have built and produced and put into the world. There is nothing inherently wrong with any of these activities in moderation. The Stoics were not ascetics who rejected pleasure, but they demanded that everything be held in its proper proportion, evaluated against the question, does this serve my purpose, my development, my life? And when the scales tip, when the hours spent consuming dramatically outweigh the hours spent creating, poverty finds fertile ground. Because here is what happens, practically and specifically, in the life of a person whose primary daily activity is consumption. They spend money on what others create without developing the capacity to earn money from what they create. They fill their time with other people's stories, other people's ideas, other people's entertainment, which means their own stories, their own ideas, their own capacity for entertainment and creation remain undeveloped, untested, unexpressed. The skill that could have been built goes unbuilt. The business that could have been started never begins. The talent that could have been developed atrophies. The knowledge that could have been applied lies dormant. Epictetus said something that strikes at the heart of this habit with surgical precision. He said that the philosopher's task, and by philosopher, he meant any person who takes the examined life seriously, is not to talk about what one has read, but to show what one has done, not to demonstrate what has been consumed, but to demonstrate what has been created from what has been consumed. In other words, consumption without creation is philosophical incompleteness, and financially, it is a habit that keeps the consumer permanently dependent on the creators. Think about the digital economy in which we live. Every platform you use, every application on your phone, every piece of content that fills your evenings, these were built by creators. And those creators are paid, sometimes paid very well, because they chose to sit on the creative side of the equation. The person who watches 10 hours of YouTube is not building wealth. The person who creates the videos, those 10 hours of watching, comprises they are. This is not to say that every person must become a content creator. The creative act can take 1,000 different forms. It can be a small business. It can be a craft mastered and offered. It can be a skill developed and sold. It can be a solution engineered and marketed. It can be a garden that produces food. It can be a workshop that produces furniture. It can be code that solves a problem. It can be teaching, coaching, consulting, building, making, growing, fixing. But it must be something. It must be something that shifts the person from the position of pure consumer to the position of someone who also generates, also produces, also creates value that the world can receive and reward. The Stoics believed that the virtuous life, the life of excellence, of arete, was always an active life, not in the sense of physical busyness, but in the sense of engaged, purposeful action directed toward meaningful ends. The Stoic ideal was the person who takes what they have been given, their circumstances, their capacities, their knowledge, their time, and makes something worthy of it. And the home where this habit of creating is absent, where the television is always on, where the scrolling never stops, where evenings are spent absorbing and mornings are spent recovering from the absorption, that home is a home where poverty is not merely possible but practically inevitable. Because the habits of creation are the habits of wealth, and they cannot be built while the hands are always reaching outward to receive rather than inward to produce. Seneca wrote, "Omnia aliena sunt, tempus tantum nostrum est." All things are external, time alone is ours. And how we choose to spend that time, whether in receiving or in making, is the choice that, over years and decades, determines the difference between a life of financial strain and a life of financial freedom. Audit your hours. Honestly, with Stoic rigor, if the calculation reveals that you are spending significantly more time consuming than creating, that is not a minor imbalance to gently address someday. That is a fundamental habit of poverty that is operating in your home right now, today, stealing your financial future one passive hour at a time. Habit 4. The habit of avoiding discomfort at all costs. Epictetus, who was enslaved for much of his early life, who experienced cold, hunger, physical pain, public humiliation, and conditions of deprivation that most people today cannot even imagine, said something that should stop every modern person in their tracks. He said, "Seek not that the things which happen should happen as you wish, but wish the things which happen to be as they are, and you will have a tranquil flow of life." But more than this, far more practically important than this, he said that a person who runs from every form of discomfort has rendered themselves permanently incapable of growth. Because growth, all growth, in every domain requires the willingness to pass through discomfort. And financial growth requires this willingness more than almost anything else. The fourth habit that brings poverty into your home is the habit of avoiding discomfort at all costs. And this habit, in the modern world, has become epidemic. We live in the most comfort-optimized civilization in the history of our species. Every form of friction has been engineered out of daily life. Food arrives at the door. Entertainment is immediately available. Warmth is regulated by a thermostat. Pain is medicated. Boredom is eliminated by a device that fits in your pocket. Difficult conversations can be avoided indefinitely through the simple act of not responding to messages. This is, in many respects, a triumph of human ingenuity, but it has produced, as a byproduct, a generation of people who have lost or perhaps never developed the capacity to willingly endure discomfort in the service of a greater goal. And this incapacity is directly and devastatingly connected to financial poverty. Let me be specific, because the Stoics were always specific. Let me name the discomforts that must be endured to build financial stability and wealth, and which the poverty-welcoming habit of avoidance causes people to escape from. The discomfort of living below your means. This is perhaps the most fundamental financial discipline, and it is profoundly uncomfortable for most people. It means saying no to purchases that feel good right now. It means watching others spend freely while you are building reserves. It means making peace with "not yet" when the entire market culture around you is screaming, "now, now, now." It is not a comfortable practice. It requires the willingness to feel temporarily deprived in order to build eventual freedom. And the person who avoids all discomfort cannot practice it. The discomfort of learning new skills. Financial advancement almost always requires the development of skills that do not currently exist. New skills require the discomfort of being a beginner, of being confused, of making mistakes, of feeling incompetent before you feel capable. A person who cannot endure the discomfort of the learning curve will always be limited to the income that their current skills can generate. And in a changing economy, current skills that are not continuously sharpened become progressively less valuable. The discomfort of having difficult financial conversations. Talking honestly about money with a partner, with family members, with a business partner, with a lender is deeply uncomfortable for most people. And the avoidance of these conversations costs people enormous amounts of money. The couple that never honestly discusses their financial situation accumulates debt in silence. The business partners who never address financial disagreements watch the enterprise deteriorate. The individual who avoids confronting their debt because facing it feels too painful allows it to compound until the pain is exponentially greater. The discomfort of taking calculated risks. Every meaningful financial advance involves some form of risk. Starting a business is risky. Investing is risky. Changing careers is risky. Negotiating a salary requires the risk of being told no. Building any new income stream requires resources, time, money, attention, energy that could be lost. And the person who has made comfort avoidance a non-negotiable life principle will not take these risks. They will stay in the safe, comfortable, poverty-preserving position of never trying anything that could fail. The discomfort of self-discipline in the face of temptation. Every financial plan eventually encounters the moment of temptation, the sale that is too good to pass up, the social event that seems to require spending, the emotional low that reaches for shopping as comfort. Resisting these moments is uncomfortable. It requires the Stoic practice of standing firm against the force of immediate desire in favor of the longer vision. And the person who cannot endure discomfort cannot maintain this discipline. Marcus Aurelius wrote about what he called "the obstacle is the way," the Stoic principle, that the very things which seem to block our progress are, in fact, the path through which progress is made. The cold morning that demands you rise anyway makes you more disciplined. The rejection that demands you try again makes you more resilient. The financial difficulty that demands creative solutions makes you more capable. The discomfort that is willingly embraced becomes the teacher that cannot be replaced by any other means. And conversely, the discomfort that is always avoided produces a person who remains permanently at the same level of capability, the same level of financial sophistication, the same level of income-generating ability. Because all growth requires friction, and all friction is uncomfortable, and a person who avoids all friction avoids all growth. The Stoics called the willingness to endure discomfort karteria, a form of endurance, a form of patient strength, a quality they ranked among the highest of human virtues. Not because suffering is good in itself, the Stoics were not masochists, but because the capacity to endure difficulty is what separates the person who is shaped by their circumstances from the person who shapes their circumstances. Poverty is comfortable. This sounds paradoxical, but it is true. The habits that produce poverty are, in the short term, almost always the more comfortable option. Sleeping late is more comfortable than rising early. Spending is more comfortable than saving. Avoiding difficult conversations is more comfortable than having them. Staying in a bad job is more comfortable than risking the uncertainty of a better one. Watching television is more comfortable than developing a skill. And so the home that has adopted the habit of avoiding discomfort at all costs is a home that has, by default, adopted the habits of poverty, because poverty is, until its consequences become undeniable, the more comfortable path. The Stoic invitation is to reverse this relationship, to choose the discomfort that serves your growth, because you have the wisdom to see that the discomfort of discipline is infinitely preferable to the discomfort of regret. As one of the most powerful Stoic ideas puts it, suffer the pain of discipline now, or suffer the pain of regret later. The pain of discipline weighs an ounce. The pain of regret weighs a ton. Habit 5. The habit of comparing and competing with others. Seneca wrote a letter to his friend Lucilius that contains one of the most economically important insights in the entire history of Western philosophy. He writes, "It is not the man who has too little who is poor, but the man who hankers after more." Read that very carefully, because it contains a truth that, once genuinely understood, can liberate a person from one of the most financially destructive forces in modern life. The 5th habit that brings poverty into your home is the habit of comparing yourself to others and making their lifestyle the standard against which your own is measured. The Stoics called this habit this constant anxious scanning of what others have, what others are doing, what others appear to be achieving, one of the primary sources of human suffering. They identified it as a fundamental failure of judgment, the judgment that confuses external appearances with internal reality, that confuses what is shown with what is true, that confuses what others possess with what you need. In the ancient world, this comparison was limited by the scope of one's immediate community. You could see your neighbors, your relatives, the people in your marketplace. The Stoics already found this sufficiently destabilizing enough of a force that they devoted considerable philosophical attention to addressing it. Imagine, then, what they would make of the modern world. A world in which, via a device that fits in your pocket, you have access not merely to the lifestyle of your immediate neighbors, but to the curated, filtered, optimized lifestyle presentations of millions of people around the world, many of whom are themselves presenting not their actual lives, but the version of their lives they wish to project. A world of highlight reels presented as lived reality. A world where the gap between what people appear to have and what they actually have has never been wider, and where the consequence of measuring yourself against those appearances has never been more financially devastating. The mechanism by which this habit creates poverty is precise and well documented, even if most people experience it as a vague but relentless pressure rather than a clearly understood process. It begins with the comparison itself. You see someone in person, on social media, in a magazine, in a film, living in a way that triggers your sense of inadequacy, a nicer home, a newer car, a more glamorous holiday, a wardrobe that signals a level of financial ease that you do not currently experience. And in that moment, something happens in the mind. The Stoics would call it a passion, a disturbance of the rational faculty, a disruption of clear judgment. The disturbance says, I should have that. The disturbance says, something is wrong with my life because I do not have that. The disturbance says, the standard by which my life should be measured is the standard set by this person who has what I lack. And from this disturbance flows spending. Spending that is not driven by need, not driven by plan, not driven by deliberate decision, but driven by the desperate, unconscious attempt to close the gap between how your life looks and how the lives of others appear to look. This is sometimes called keeping up with the Joneses in common speech, but it is far more financially precise than that phrase suggests. It is the mechanism behind the purchase of goods that cannot be afforded. It is the mechanism behind the credit card debt that accumulates slowly until it cannot be managed. It is the mechanism behind the lifestyle inflation that ensures that as income rises, spending rises with it, and financial progress remains permanently elusive. It is the mechanism behind the psychological state in which no income level ever feels sufficient because the reference point keeps moving, because the person against whom you are measuring yourself has always moved slightly beyond wherever you currently are. The Stoics had a name for what the comparison habit does to rational judgment. They called it disturbing the hegemonic, disrupting the ruling faculty of the mind, the part of us that is capable of clear, objective evaluation. When the hegemonic is disturbed by comparison, we no longer see what is real. We see only what is lacking. We no longer feel what is sufficient. We feel only what is insufficient. And a person in this state cannot make rational financial decisions because their financial decisions are no longer being made from a clear-eyed assessment of their actual needs and goals. They are being made from the anxious, reactive place of, I need to close the gap between my life and that life. Marcus Aurelius wrote about the freedom that comes from releasing the comparison habit, and he described it in financial terms that are startling in their modernity. He wrote about the person who has learned to value only what is genuinely worth valuing: health, wisdom, virtue, meaningful relationships, purposeful work, and who has therefore freed themselves from the financial servitude of chasing appearances. Because here is the great Stoic insight that modern financial culture desperately needs. Most of what people spend money to appear to have is purchased not for the joy of having it, but for the social signal it sends. The car that is beyond the budget is not purchased for transportation. It is purchased for the message it broadcasts about status. The holiday, photographed extensively for social media and then posted before the tan has faded, is not purchased primarily for rest and renewal. It is purchased for the image it creates. The wardrobe, the restaurant, the neighborhood, the school. So much of what drives financial decisions in the comparison culture is not about the thing itself, but about what having the thing signals to others. And the Stoics would say, you are paying real money, accumulating real debt, sacrificing real financial security for the opinions of people who, as Marcus Aurelius observed, you may not even particularly like or respect. This is not a financially rational strategy. It is a recipe for poverty dressed in the costume of prosperity. The Stoic practice that addresses this habit is what they called premeditatio. In its applied form, the deliberate, rational examination of what one actually values and why. What is the life that you, specifically, with your specific temperament and values and circumstances and goals, actually want to build? Not the life that looks impressive from the outside. Not the life that generates the most flattering photographs. Not the life that causes the most envy in others, but the life that actually serves your deepest human flourishing? When you have clarity on that question, real Stoic clarity, the kind that comes from honest examination rather than social performance, the comparison habit loses much of its power. Because you are no longer measuring yourself against a moving, externally defined standard, you are measuring yourself against your own vision of what a good life, for you, actually looks like. And that vision, if it is genuinely yours, almost never requires the kind of spending that comparison drives. Almost never requires the debt that keeping up with appearances demands. Almost never looks like poverty in disguise. The family that has defeated the comparison habit is a family that has become, quietly and powerfully, financially free in a way that many higher-income families never achieve, because their spending reflects their values rather than their neighbors' appearances. And every time the comparison habit is broken, poverty loses one of its most reliable invitations. Habit 6. The habit of making financial decisions from emotion. Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism, identified what he called the passions, fear, desire, pleasure, and distress, as the primary forces that corrupt clear judgment and lead human beings to act in ways that work against their own long-term well-being. He was not saying that emotions are inherently bad. The Stoics were nuanced on this point. They distinguished between passions, which are irrational and disruptive, and good feelings, which are appropriate emotional responses aligned with right reason. But on the question of financial decision-making, the Stoics were unambiguous. Decisions made from fear, from excitement, from distress, from the desperate need for immediate relief of discomfort, these decisions almost always lead to outcomes that the rational mind, reviewed in calm reflection, would never have chosen. The sixth habit that brings poverty into your home is the habit of making financial decisions from emotion. And before you tell yourself that this does not apply to you, that you are a rational person who makes thoughtful financial choices, I want to invite you into the Stoic practice of honest self-examination, because this habit is extraordinarily subtle and extraordinarily pervasive, and it operates in most people's financial lives far more extensively than they realize. Let us examine the emotional states from which financial decisions are most commonly made, and the specific poverty they create. Fear-based financial decisions. Fear of missing out drives some of the most destructive financial behavior in the modern world. The investment that seems to be going up and will surely continue going up bought at the top out of fear of being left behind. The business opportunity that must be seized immediately, or it will be gone forever, entered into without adequate due diligence, because the fear of missing out overwhelmed the calm assessment of risk. The insurance policy sold by someone who skillfully amplified fear of disaster to close the deal, purchased in excess of what the person's actual risk profile requires. Fear of confrontation drives the financial decisions that are never made at all. The salary negotiation that never happens because asking feels too frightening. The contract renegotiation that is never initiated because the conversation seems too risky. The debt that is never addressed because looking at it honestly is terrifying. Fear avoidance is just as financially destructive as fear-driven action. Excitement-based financial decisions are the most seductive of the emotional traps. The new business idea that generates such enthusiasm that due diligence feels unnecessary. The hot stock that everyone is talking about, purchased in a state of excitement that overrides any careful analysis. The impulsive purchase made in a moment of retail euphoria, the experience of shopping as emotional regulation, as joy, as celebration that feels completely justified in the moment and deeply regrettable in the review of the bank statement. Distress-based financial decisions are perhaps the most tragic, and they disproportionately affect those who are already experiencing financial difficulty. When a person is in financial distress, when the anxiety of not having enough is acute and constant, their capacity for clear financial reasoning is significantly impaired. This is not a character flaw. It is a well-documented psychological reality. Scarcity, real or perceived, narrows cognitive bandwidth. It creates a tunnel vision that focuses relentlessly on the immediate problem and cannot easily consider the longer-term consequences. And predatory financial products, payday loans, high-interest credit cards, schemes that promise quick relief are specifically designed to capture people in this state of distress. They offer immediate emotional relief at devastating long-term financial cost. And the person in distress, whose emotional regulatory system is overwhelmed, often reaches for that relief without being able to fully process what it will cost them. Boredom and loneliness drive financial decisions in ways that are almost never acknowledged honestly. Shopping as entertainment, spending as social participation, the purchase that feels like an experience, a story, a connection when what is actually being sought is meaning or community or stimulation. The Stoics understood that many human behaviors that appear to be about their surface content, shopping, eating, drinking, are actually attempts to address emotional needs that the behavior can never truly meet. Marcus Aurelius wrote extensively about what he called the practice of the returning gaze, the discipline of regularly stepping back from one's own emotional state and examining it with the objective curiosity of a scientist. Not judging the emotion, not suppressing it, but examining it, asking, what am I actually feeling right now? Why am I feeling it? And is the action I am about to take actually responsive to this feeling in a productive way, or is it simply reactive? This practice, applied to financial decisions, would prevent an enormous proportion of the purchases, investments, and financial commitments that are made each year and later regretted. Because most financially destructive decisions look very different when examined with even a brief delay, a small amount of additional information, and the simple question, if I were not feeling what I am currently feeling, would I make this same decision? The Stoic practice for this habit is what might be called the pause of reason, the deliberate insertion of time and reflection between the emotional impulse and the financial action. The Stoics recommended that major decisions, and they included financial decisions in this category, be made only after the emotional state that is driving them has been identified and accounted for, not necessarily dismissed but understood. They also recommended what we might call prospective regret analysis, asking before making a significant financial decision, how will I feel about this in a year? In 5 years? In 10 years? Not how will I feel about it in the immediate moment of completion, when the emotional satisfaction of having acted will still be fresh, but when the consequences, both positive and negative, are fully visible. This practice does not eliminate emotion from financial life, nor should it. Passion, enthusiasm, and the emotional connection to one's goals and values can be powerful drivers of financial discipline. The person who is deeply emotionally connected to the vision of what their financial freedom will make possible for their children, for their community, for the life they intend to build can draw enormous motivational energy from that emotional engagement. But there is a critical difference between the emotions that clarify and the emotions that distort. The Stoic discipline of emotional governance is about learning to tell the difference, to welcome the emotions that illuminate your true values and dismiss the emotions that simply hijack your rational judgment in service of the present moment's comfort. The home where financial decisions are routinely made from fear, excitement, distress, or boredom is a home where poverty is being manufactured steadily and silently, one emotional purchase at a time. And the antidote is not the elimination of feeling, but the cultivation of the Stoic practice of feeling and thinking at the same time, allowing the mind to serve as the check on the heart, so that what is felt is expressed in ways that serve rather than undermine the financial life you are trying to build. Habit 7, the habit of living without a philosophy. We have arrived at the 7th habit, and I want you to hear this carefully, because it is the deepest of the 7, and it is the one that, when changed, has the power to address all the others simultaneously. The 7th habit that brings poverty into your home is the habit of living without a philosophy, without a clear, coherent, examined set of principles that govern how you relate to money, to work, to time, to desire, and to your own potential. And before this sounds abstract, before the practical, financially minded person dismisses this as philosophical luxury for people who already have their material needs met. Let me be very precise about what I mean and why the Stoics considered this the most practically important habit of all. A philosophy of life is not a luxury, it is a necessity. It is the foundation on which all financial decisions, all financial habits, all financial behaviors are built. Without it, every other financial technique, tool, and strategy is building on sand. Consider, you can be given a budget template and the knowledge of how to use it. But if your philosophy of life positions the present moment as the only real thing and the future as an abstraction not worth sacrificing for, you will not maintain the budget. You can be taught the principles of investing, but if your philosophy of life says that fate controls all outcomes and individual action is ultimately meaningless, you will not invest consistently. You can be told about the importance of living below your means. But if your philosophy of life measures success by the social signals of consumption rather than the reality of financial freedom, you will not choose a modest lifestyle, regardless of the advice you receive. The philosophy comes first, always. The behavior follows the philosophy. And in the absence of a deliberate, examined philosophy, a default philosophy fills the vacuum, and the default philosophy of modern consumer culture is almost perfectly designed to produce financial mediocrity. The default philosophy says, happiness is found in acquisition. The default philosophy says, the purpose of income is immediate consumption. The default philosophy says, the future is uncertain, so enjoy the present. The default philosophy says, financial success is about what you can show, not what you actually have. The default philosophy says, you deserve it now, regardless of whether you have earned it, saved for it, or can sustain it. This is not a philosophy that has been consciously chosen. It is a philosophy that has been absorbed, gradually and pervasively, from advertising, from media, from the cultural water in which all of us swim. And it is a philosophy that, if not consciously examined and replaced, will guide financial behavior in the direction of perpetual poverty, regardless of how much income is generated. The Stoics built an explicit, examined, deliberately chosen philosophy of life, and they applied it to every domain, including the economic. And the financial dimensions of Stoic philosophy, taken seriously and practiced consistently, constitute something very close to a complete manual for building financial stability and eventual wealth. What does a Stoic financial philosophy look like, concretely? It begins with the clear identification of what the Stoics called goods, the things that are genuinely valuable because they contribute to human flourishing, as distinct from things that merely appear valuable because they are desirable or prestigious. The Stoics identified virtue, wisdom, justice, courage, and self-discipline as the genuine goods. They identified wealth, status, and physical pleasure as preferred indifference, things that are nice to have and reasonable to pursue, but which do not constitute genuine well-being and should never be sought at the expense of the genuine goods. This distinction has enormous financial power. A person who has internalized it clearly understands that no level of spending can produce genuine well-being if the genuine goods, virtue, wisdom, meaningful relationships, purposeful work are absent. And conversely, a person who has these genuine goods is far less vulnerable to the compensatory spending that many people employ in their attempt to address their absence. A Stoic financial philosophy includes what we might call temporal wisdom, the clear-eyed understanding that the future is real, that it will arrive, and that what you do today will determine what the future contains. This is what separates the person who saves and invests from the person who spends everything that comes in. Not a difference in income necessarily, but a difference in the philosophical relationship to time. The Stoics were relentless in their insistence that the present moment must be understood in the context of a life, a whole life, with a past from which lessons can be drawn and a future toward which deliberate action can be directed. A Stoic financial philosophy includes what might be called tranquility through sufficiency, the practiced capacity to experience contentment with what is genuinely adequate, rather than living in a perpetual state of not yet enough. This is not an acceptance of mediocrity. The Stoics were ambitious and driven, but they located the goal of ambition in the development of excellence, in becoming more capable, more wise, more virtuous, rather than in the accumulation of goods as an end in itself. And this orientation produces a very different economic behavior than the orientation that positions more as always better and enough as always slightly beyond wherever one currently is. A Stoic financial philosophy includes the practice of memento mori, the regular contemplation of mortality, not as a morbid exercise, but as a clarifying one. The person who genuinely understands that their time is finite, that there are only so many mornings, so many opportunities, so many years of productive capacity, treats their resources very differently from the person who lives as if time is unlimited and the consequences of today's choices can always be addressed tomorrow. And a Stoic financial philosophy includes what Epictetus called the discipline of desire, the trained capacity to distinguish between desires that serve your genuine well-being and desires that merely feel compelling, because they have been activated by advertising, social comparison, or emotional distress. This discipline is not the elimination of desire, it is the governance of desire, the redirection of desire toward what is genuinely worth having. Now, here is why this is the most important of the 7 habits. Because without a philosophy, all the practical financial advice in the world is ultimately insufficient. People who have been given budgets do not use them. People who understand compound interest do not invest consistently. People who know the dangers of debt continue to accumulate it. Not because they are ignorant, but because knowledge without philosophy does not change behavior. The change that lasts, the change that reshapes not just a single financial decision but an entire financial life, comes from the level of philosophy, from the deep, examined, honestly confronted level of what you believe about life, about time, about money, about your own nature, about what you are actually here to do. Marcus Aurelius governed an empire and wrote philosophy because he understood that the philosophy was not separate from the governance. The philosophy was what made the governance possible, what gave it direction, what gave it integrity, what gave it the capacity to endure. And the financial life of any individual household is no different. The philosophy is not separate from the financial decisions. The philosophy is what gives the financial decisions their direction, their integrity, and their capacity to build something that lasts. The family that has a clear, examined, deliberately chosen philosophy of life, one that takes money seriously without worshiping it, that values the future without abandoning the present, that pursues excellence without sacrificing integrity, that family builds wealth. Not necessarily dramatic wealth, not necessarily spectacular wealth, but the quiet, durable, genuinely liberating financial security that is the proper fruit of a life well-examined and well-lived. The family that lives without a philosophy that responds to each financial situation as it comes, driven by impulse and emotion and the default cultural scripts about consumption and success, that family remains permanently vulnerable to poverty, regardless of the income it generates. Choose your philosophy deliberately. Examine it honestly. Correct it where it has been corrupted by cultural absorption and unreflective habit, and apply it consistently, daily, in the small financial decisions that accumulate over time into the financial life you inhabit. The synthesis, what the Stoics understood that we have forgotten. Before we move into the conclusion, I want to draw these 7 habits together into the single underlying insight that connects them all, the insight that the Stoics understood with extraordinary depth and that modern financial culture has largely forgotten. Poverty is not primarily a condition of the external world. It is, at its deepest level, a condition of the inner world, a condition of habits, of language, of philosophy, of the daily choices that seem too small to matter until, looked at in aggregate over years and decades, they reveal themselves to have been the most consequential choices of all. Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, Epictetus, they were not writing about finance. They were writing about something larger, about how a human being, living in conditions of uncertainty and impermanence and limited control, can build an inner life of such clarity, such discipline, such richness, that it naturally and inevitably expresses itself in an outer life of excellence. The Stoics understood that a person cannot be financially poor and spiritually rich in the fullest sense, not because money determines character, but because the habits that build genuine spiritual wealth and the habits that build genuine financial health are the same habits. They overlap almost perfectly. The habit of rising with purpose, the habit of speaking with power and intentionality, the habit of creating rather than merely consuming, the habit of willing endurance of necessary discomfort, the habit of measuring life against one's own values rather than others' appearances, the habit of making decisions from reason rather than emotion, the habit of living from a deliberate, examined philosophy rather than a defaulted cultural script. These are the habits of the Stoic sage, and they are the habits of the financially free person, not because the Stoics were writing a self-help financial guide, but because the examined, disciplined, purposeful life they described is simply the kind of life that, when practiced fully, produces outcomes of genuine quality in every domain it touches, including the financial one. Now, ask yourself honestly, with the full force of Stoic self-examination, which of these 7 habits is currently operating in your home? Not as an accusation, as an inquiry, as the beginning of understanding, because you cannot change what you have not seen, and once you have seen it, once the habit is visible, named, understood in its mechanism and its consequences, the power it holds over you begins to diminish. This is the first gift of philosophy, visibility. The second gift is choice. And the third gift, earned through the sustained practice of choosing differently, is transformation. You have begun that process today by choosing to listen, to reflect, to engage honestly with ideas that challenge comfortable patterns. Do not let it end here. Carry these ideas into the morning. Carry them into the conversations you have with yourself before the household wakes. Carry them into the financial decisions of the coming week. The Stoics did not promise that philosophy would solve all problems. They promised something more valuable, that it would give you the clarity to see what the problems actually are, the courage to face them honestly, and the tools to address them with wisdom and consistency over time. That is more than enough to change a life. In fact, it is exactly what changing a life requires. The invitation to deeper practice. Before we reach our conclusion, I want to offer you something practical, a 7-day practice that you can begin immediately, built directly from the Stoic principles we have explored today. Day 1 is the day of the morning. Wake up before the first demand of the day has been made of you. Give yourself 30 minutes of uninterrupted time. Use it to write, just write, freely, honestly, about what you want your financial life to look like in 5 years. Not what you expect, what you want. Feel the difference between those two questions. Day 2 is the day of language. For the entire day, pay attention to every sentence you speak or think about money. Every one. Carry a notebook or use your phone to note them down. At the end of the day, review them. Are these the words of someone who is building wealth, or the words of someone who has accepted poverty as identity? Day 3 is the day of creation. Identify something, anything that you could create and potentially offer as value to the world. A piece of writing, a small piece of work in your field of skill, a solution to a problem that you have noticed and that others likely share. Do not launch it yet. Simply identify it. begin to shape it, and feel the difference between creating and consuming. Day 4 is the day of chosen discomfort. Choose one thing you have been avoiding, one difficult conversation, one financial task, one skill you have been meaning to develop, one risk you have been too afraid to take. Take the first step toward it. Just the first step. Notice how the anticipatory discomfort was larger than the actual discomfort of the action. Day 5 is the day of the mirror, not the window. Spend the day consciously refusing to compare your situation to anyone else's. Every time the comparison impulse arises on social media, in conversation, in your own internal monologue, gently but firmly redirect it to your own vision, your own values, your own specific and personal goals. Day 6 is the day of the pause. Before every financial decision, every purchase, every financial commitment, every choice about where money goes, pause for 60 seconds and ask, am I making this decision from a clear, rational evaluation of my genuine needs and goals, or from an emotional state that will have passed by tomorrow? Day 7 is the day of philosophy. Sit with a blank page and write your personal financial philosophy. What do you actually believe about money? About enough? About the relationship between financial security and genuine human flourishing? About what you are building and why? Write it as if you are writing a letter to your children or to your future self. Let it be honest, imperfect, and real. These 7 days will not solve everything, but they will begin the process of replacing the habits of poverty with the habits of a Stoic, the habits of someone who has decided deliberately and irreversibly to take authorship of their own financial life. And that decision made today, in this moment, is worth more than any specific financial technique or tactic could ever be, because the person who has made this decision will find the techniques and apply them. The person who has not made this decision will learn the techniques and abandon them, or never use them at all. Begin today. The morning is always early enough to start. We have traveled far today through 7 habits, through the philosophy of some of the greatest thinkers in the history of human civilization, through the honest, sometimes uncomfortable territory of self-examination. And here is what I want to leave you with as we close this conversation. The Stoics did not write for people who had everything figured out. They wrote for people who were in the middle of the struggle, the middle of the uncertainty, the middle of the difficulty, the middle of the gap between where they were and where they wanted to be. They wrote because they believed, with absolute conviction, that the human mind, when properly disciplined and properly directed, is capable of extraordinary transformation. You are that human mind. Whatever has happened in your financial life until today, whatever habits have been operating, whatever decisions have been made from a place less than your best wisdom, none of it determines what happens from this moment forward. From this moment forward, you have seen the 7 doors through which poverty enters. You have been given the Stoic tools to close them. And you have been reminded of what the greatest philosophers in history knew and practiced. That the life worth living is the life deliberately chosen, deliberately built, deliberately sustained by the kind of daily discipline that seems small in any individual moment and becomes transformative across the years of a lifetime. Rise with purpose, speak with power, create with courage, endure with patience, measure by your own standard, decide with reason, live by philosophy. These are the habits that build not just financial wealth, but the kind of inner wealth that no external circumstance can ever fully take away. If today's message reached something deep in you, if you heard something here that has never quite been said to you in this way before, I am asking you, sincerely and directly, to help spread this wisdom by liking this video right now. That simple act tells the world that this kind of content is worth finding. It brings these ideas to people who need them, people who might be listening to the wrong voices, people who might be one piece of wisdom away from a significant change in their lives. Please share this video with someone who needs it. Not someone who already has everything figured out, but someone who is in the middle of the struggle, who might be unknowingly practicing one or more of these 7 habits, who might benefit enormously from hearing this message today rather than years from now. A friend, a family member, a colleague, someone whose financial well-being matters to you. Share it with them and let the Stoics speak to them through you. Subscribe to Stoic Wisdom if you have not already. This channel exists for one purpose: to bring the most powerful, most practical, most life-transforming wisdom of the ancient Stoics into the reality of modern life, and to do it in a way that is honest, deep, and genuinely useful. Not surface-level motivation that fades by morning, but the kind of philosophical grounding that changes the way you see and respond to your life from the inside out. And if Stoic wisdom has made a difference in your life, if something you have heard on this channel has helped you think more clearly, act more deliberately, or find greater peace in the midst of difficulty, please consider expressing that gratitude through super thanks. Your support is not just financial, it is a signal, a confirmation that this work matters, that going this deep is worth it, that the world still hungers for wisdom that is honest and true. Every super thanks helps us continue creating at the level of quality and depth that you deserve. Leave a comment below this video. Tell us which of the 7 habits resonated most deeply with you. Tell us which one you are committed to changing. Tell us about a Stoic principle that has already shaped your life, or one you intend to begin practicing. Your words in the comments section create a community of people who are genuinely trying to live better, think more clearly, and build lives of real and lasting quality. That community is one of the most valuable things this channel has produced, and your presence in it matters. The Stoics would remind us, as we close, that the best moment to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best moment is now. The best moment to build the habits of financial wisdom was in childhood, learned from parents and mentors who had the wisdom to teach them. But the second best moment is today, this morning, this conversation, this decision made now, in full awareness, with eyes open and philosophy intact to live differently from this point forward. Marcus Aurelius closed many of his journal entries with a kind of quiet, firm resolve, not a dramatic declaration, but a recommitment, a reminder to himself that today was another chance, another morning, another opportunity to be the person he intended to be. We offer you that same reminder now, in the spirit of the Stoics, with all the sincerity and conviction that 2,000 years of tested wisdom deserves. Today is another chance. Rise early, speak with power, create something, endure what must be endured, measure by your own standard, decide from wisdom, live deliberately. The door to poverty can be closed. It is your door. You hold the key. Close it today. This is Stoic Wisdom, and we will see you in the next one.